Maura?
Yep. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. I'm back in the room, and I see the screen. And will I advance, or will you advance?
We could do it like last time. I'm happy to advance.
Or is it easier if we both can, just in case I need to go back and forth without bugging you?
Sure, but that creates this sort of a co-host situation, which
that's yes.
Yeah, and then some of the functionality changes, and when I have the cursor, you have a delay.
Forget that. I remember that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm more than happy to advance.
And so, we did this before, and we're going to go into more depth now. How long should I go roughly before questions, or how do you want to work that this time?
Sure. Well, it's your preference. I think last time we held questions to the end, and of course we encouraged folks to submit them via chat. But if you want to do it that same way, I'm happy to support that.
I think that's probably best. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Then I would say maybe 45 minutes of content. We'll give people, a chance for 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll wrap up probably about 5 of the hour.
Okay, fine. And if I go, I could go for hours, but if I go a little bit shorter, we could maybe get discussion, just so it's not boring people to death with a lecture.
Sure. And if you'd like to, I was going to say you could certainly, after there's a little Q&A, just say that stopped. You could, of course, add in, you could, ad lib or, provide anything. You'd have some extra time if you wanted to fill. You could go back on it at the point.
And if you get via chat or however a burning question that can't wait, feel free to interrupt and I'll take it and move on.
Absolutely. Will do. Sure.
Yep.
I was just doing a little test.
Yep.
Do you have a dog?
Do not have a dog. However, as our house is completing renovation, we are staying with people who have a dog downstairs.
Ah, okay.
In case you hear a bark or two.
Yes, yeah, that's okay. No problem. reminder for anyone who's joining, please ensure that your video is turned off. And if you don't necessarily know how to do that, I will ultimately do it for you. But if you could be proactive and try to turn that off before you join the call, that'd be great.
You can eat through today, so whatever. Not too big. Severe.
Oh, there's a little puppy. Hi, little puppy.
Just gonna put a note in my time.
I can see the little Pomeranian running around in the background.
There's two, and he'll be gone in a second.
To everyone who is joining us by phone, we'll start probably in a little just after the hour to allow people a chance to log on. Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. Thanks for joining us. Just sit tight for just a few more moments to allow as many people to join the call as possible. Thanks. Just a reminder to folks, you'll want to turn off your video in Zoom by simply disabling the Start Video icon in Zoom. Hi, everyone who's just joined us. We'll start in just a few moments. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to see the participant numbers continuing to climb. So we'll wait about another 2 minutes to allow as many people to join, and then we'll get started. Dr. Hinshaw, just a moment. Somehow you've been muted. Bear with me one moment. Let's unmute you. There we go. Okay, you should be. Oh, you're still muted. Can you hit the? Yep, there you go.
So I couldn't hear anything as about all of the participants could not until about 10 seconds ago.
Oh dear. Okay.
So if you gave an intro, I don't think anyone heard it because I certainly did not.
Okay. I did give an intro, so let me briefly go through that again. Would you mind if I we'll do that real quickly?
I think you have to because there's a lot of chats up that no one could hear anything.
There we go. Okay, thanks so much. Sorry, everyone. Okay, let's try this again. So sorry for the technical snafu here. I noticed that, yes, there's a lot of chatter. I'm hosting and speaking at the same time, so I'm going to have to defer your chat points for just a moment. I have a feeling most of them are related to the fact that people can't hear me. So I hope everyone can hear me now. I wonder if it's when I started my video for some reason, the mute button or the
I bet
muted
that's
button.
what happened. Yeah.
Okay, everyone can hear me and see me. Yes? Okay. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our first speaker in the UC Stigma-Free series has returned to bestow his knowledge upon us once again. We are fortunate to have Stephen Hinshaw with us again this morning. And we'll get started in just a minute after I go over some logistics. And folks, please remember to stop your video. There is a slide presentation. Everyone should be able to see the welcome slide or the first slide of the deck now on screen. And if not, please use the URL posted on UCNet under News or via the article on the main page of UCNet. We are recording this webinar, so all lines have been muted. And we do want to hear from you, so please use the Zoom chat feature to submit your questions. The chat icon will appear if you hover your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom application window. A toolbar will appear, and you click on the word chat with a little cartoon bubble, and the chat dialog box will open. You type your question in the field, and then you hit enter to send it. And speaking of questions, Dr. Hinshaw would prefer to field questions at the end of the presentation, so please post your questions in the chat, and we will discuss them when he's finished. And of course, if there's a particular burning question that's very relevant to the slide, I will interject and ask Dr. Hinshaw to field that question. By the end of this week, a complete recording of this webinar, both audio and visual, will be available on the Stigma-Free UC page, which is part of UC Living Well on UCNet. So with our webinar house now in order, I'd like to explain a little bit about how today's session fits into the bigger picture. The webinar was created in partnership with Stephen and the Stigma-Free UC initiative, which is part of System-Wide Wellbeing. UC System-Wide Wellbeing sponsors and promotes events, programs, and resources that impact and improve UC employees' emotional, financial, physical, and nutritional well-being. And in support of UC employees' emotional well-being, the Stigma-Free UC initiative was developed to foster open, positive discussions about mental health, because the first step in reducing and eliminating prejudice regarding mind disorders is to talk about them and to promote awareness around this multifaceted topic. So to that end, Stigma-Free UC is winding down its one-year awareness project that provides monthly programming and focuses on the elimination of mental illness discrimination through educational webinars, discussions, videos, and more. And because every human being lies somewhere on the mental illness continuum, the overarching goal is to increase our collective compassion on the topic by sharing the vast knowledge of UC experts like Dr. Hinshaw, who will help us learn about the spectrum of mind disorders and how to avoid ostracizing individuals who live with them. This polarizing concept of the other or the crazy person no longer exists. The continuum of mental health and illness encompasses all of us. Statistics show that those who learn about mind disorders show more compassion towards those with a disorder. Therefore, throughout the 2018 programs, we have and will continue to emphasize that mind disorders are simply part of the human condition. So now let me please hand it over to Dr. Hinshaw.
Hi, and I hope everyone can hear me. It was good to hear you, Mara, second time around. And so we're starting not much after Berkeley Standard Time. All classes up here start at 10 after the hour. So we're not in too bad shape. And I'm going to talk for maybe a half hour, maybe more, maybe less, but I would love to get discussion going either during, if there's a burning question, as Mara said, or at the end. So let's go to the first slide and start in. So I did this webinar a number of months ago, early in the calendar year, and I'm repeating, but trying to emphasize some key points more. What is stigma? It's a Greek term. Most psychological and psychiatric terms come from the Greek language. Back in Athens, if you were at the Agora, the marketplace, it might have been a good idea for you to have looked at your fellow shoppers and realize who had actually fought for Sparta or who was a former slave, both highly shunned conditions. And the way you could tell was a brand had been burned into the upper body skin of such an individual. So stigma is literally a mark. It's a burn. It's a signal of a shameful, dehumanized outgroup condition. Most stigma today is psychological rather than physical. Hitler did brand people in concentration camps with numbers on their wrists. Some nations 30 years ago branded literally HIV positive individuals as a signal to keep away from preventing the spread of the virus. But most stigma today is inferred psychologically rather than a literal mark. From the middle of the slide, there's many groups in many societies that are stigmatized, that are cast as outgroups. Some things changed. Left-handedness was highly stigmatized half a century ago. Today, we think that if you're left-handed, you have great spatial abilities and you get into MIT rather than a UC, and it's a great thing. So as social mores change, formerly stigmatized attributes may be less so. We know that, for example, across the United States, in 2001, 38% of people, this is the Pew Charitable Trust data, 38% of Americans were in favor of gay marriage, which had jumped to 63% 15 years later by 2016. For some social issues, we're finding very fast destigmatization. However, even in 2018 today, heading toward the bottom of the slide, the three groups that receive more stigma than any other groups to which you could belong are, do you use and abuse drugs? Are you homeless? And or do you have a mental illness? Stigma toward mental illness is not changing fast at all, as we'll talk about subsequently. So let's move to the next slide. Back in 1950, some famous Berkeley psychologists and sociologists wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. This was an analysis of how could a decade before so many German citizens gone along with Hitler's regime. And the answer from the early 50s perspective was that because of child rearing, because of very psychoanalytic constructs, a certain percentage of people in a given society, harsh repressive parenting, they introject these norms, become bigots. Today, social psychologists believe that that may be true for a small subset, but au contraire, stigma is part of what we all have to do every day to survive in our social worlds. We meet a lot of people. We have to quickly categorize them as like us or not quite like us, as old versus young, wearing glasses versus not. What skin color or religious group do you belong to? Skin color do you have, or religious group do you belong to? And if you didn't have some immediate stereotypes, moving down the slide here, again, it would be hard to navigate the social world. But when those stereotypes become affectively tinged, now they're prejudices. I'm not sure that I like people who are in group A, B, or C. And in the triad of social psychology, it's highly likely that individuals and society at large would discriminate against, take away rights from members of those groups, even exterminate them at its extreme. So stigma can emanate from everyday social cognition. We've evolved to be social. We evolved also to, as a species, to learn to be wary of outsiders. But at its extreme, if we think an outgroup is quite threatening, we may not want them around at all. Stigma involves stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and even more. If I stigmatize you or your group, everything about you pertains to your group membership. Your individuality and your humanity are lost. Let's advance, please. So I wrote a book on this topic, as I mentioned, the first webinar back last winter, called The Mark of Shame. It's now a 10-year-old book, Oxford Press. I chose for the cover image a detail of Hieronymus Bosch's famous painting, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness. In Holland, in 1496, when this painting was painted, the cause of mental illness was thought to be a rock or a stone inside the skull of the afflicted individual. So very quickly in this painting, we see the surgeon, but the surgeon is also wearing a wizard hat, so we should be cautious right away. Extracting the stone, the priest with the chalice is giving a blessing. The poor patient is the only one giving us direct eye contact. He's having his skull trepaned or cut into without anesthetics. But if you look closely at the slide, it doesn't look like a rock or a stone is emerging. There's a couple of little white tufts. The name for mental illness in Holland in 1496 was called a tulip head. You were a tulip head. Tulips were and still are the major source of commerce in the Netherlands, as we call them today. So Bosch was satirically painting that if the surgeon removed the tulip, removed the flower, removed the label, maybe the mental illness would be cured. So it's an eerily modern painting, because we still debate today whether having a psychiatric diagnosis or label actually helps you, frees you, takes away blame, gets you access to treatment, or something to be quite ashamed of. Let's move to the next slide. If, as I detail in that book, you look across history, Eastern, Western societies, mental illness is depicted in the classic literatures of just about every society, and society's general response towards severe mental illness has been to banish from society, to have live in forests out in the wilderness, or to place in very severe institutions. Think of leper colonies for people with leprosy today called Hansen's disease. There's something about these irrational behaviors of people with mental illness that society needs to protect itself from. So stigma is not new. It's been around as long as we've been a species. How do we measure stigma? Well, we can get attitudes from a large group of people through sampling, social and clinical psychological studies, and most of those studies deal with questionnaires. So you might have a person that you're confronted with a certain diagnosis or having the general label of mental illness, and would you want to be close to that person or far from that person? So these are overt attitude studies. As Susan Fiske, the social neuropsychologist at Princeton, has said, most people tend to categorize others on dimensions of warmth versus coldness and competence versus incompetence. People with mental illness end up being perceived as both low in warmth and low in competence, what she calls the lowest of the low. When we confront people that we believe to be low warmth and low competence, one of the primary emotions that's elicited, even before much conscious reflection or retrospection, is disgust. We want to keep away from such people. They might be contaminating of us. So these are harsh ideas that may underlie the harsh treatment of people with mental illness throughout history. Maybe actually the picture is even worse if we get at more unconscious attitudes of social perceivers. You can use implicit association or implicit attitudes tests to get reactions times to images of people with or without mental illness paired with good or bad attributes, and the unconscious biases many people have, may be actually worse than their conscious biases. Implicit attitudes are used a lot in studies of racial prejudice these days. They're beginning to be used in studies of mental health conditions as well. There's other levels of evidence for stigma that don't require empirical studies. We could be amateur anthropologists for a moment and look at policies across our country or across the world. In half of our United States today, if you admit to having a mental illness or a history of such, you can't renew your driver's license, you lose the right to vote, you can't serve on a jury or run for office, and you pretty much automatically lose custody of your kids. As I say in The Mark of Shame, it's a very good thing that such laws weren't on the books in 1860, because Lincoln could have never run for president given his history of serious depressions, very probable hypomanic episodes. He would probably have been diagnosed with what today we call bipolar disorder type 2. And if we look at the media, there are more human interest stories, more sensitive coverage of mental health issues than before, but the predominant image still, what's the face of mental illness in the media? Violent young men in their 20s who are school shooters, or what we see every day in major urban areas, homeless people muttering to themselves, living under the freeways or on the streets. We still haven't humanized mental health issues or understood the full range of them the way we should. So that's a brief historical and psychological tour. Let's move to the next slide. If a group is stigmatized, first, the members of that group are almost inevitably going to know what the stereotypes and prejudices are. They have been subjects of discrimination. So it was initially thought to be inevitable. Today it's thought to be likely, but not necessarily inevitable. If you're a member of a stigmatized group, you may internalize that stigma. You may show self-stigma. You may tend to believe that you yourself are not worthy of the full rights of society as people of the majority in group. Why is this a big issue for mental health? Even taking into account psychological symptoms of anxiety or depression, people with mental health issues who have high levels of self-stigma are unlikely to get treatment, or even before treatment assessment, or if they're in treatment, are fairly highly likely to drop out before the treatment is completed. So this internalization of public stigma by the self mitigates against getting the treatment that not only would help people's impairments, but may ultimately reduce the stigma that society members have. So as you can readily tell, we're in a vicious cycle here. Let's move to the next slide. Another related concept is courtesy stigma. Irving Goffman, the noted sociologist at Berkeley, who did his work several decades ago, wrote a book on stigma in 1963. It's a little thin paperback, contains just about everything on stigma you'd ever want to know. In one of the chapters of that book, Goffman said, tongue fully in cheek, if society stigmatizes a certain group, it's only common courtesy for society to stigmatize anybody close to members of that group, family members, associates, neighbors. It's a courtesy, again sarcastically, to extend the shadow of stigma to those around the stigmatized individual. This is a huge issue for families. Not only is there courtesy stigma for family members, but for a good portion of the 20th century, psychological theory directly blamed parents for having caused their offspring's autism or schizophrenia. The refrigerator parent theory of autism, now completely discounted, or the schizophrenic mother, the hostile, cruel, demanding yet cold mother who caused the offspring's schizophrenia. We now know that biology and genes are vulnerabilities. Certainly trauma can enact some of those latent tendencies, but parents were directly blamed. No wonder lack of seeking of treatment for their kids' conditions would have been prevalent back then. Family members talk about, for their kids who need special ed or psychiatric services, objective burden. This costs a lot of money. We have to take time off work. But the subjective burden, the shame, not telling in-laws, not telling neighbors, keeping it under wraps, is perceived by family, not surprisingly, as even more pernicious than the objective burden. Finally, who else might be under the shadow of courtesy stigma? Social workers, school psychologists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists. These are professionals who, quote, work with crazy people, work with people who are the lowest of the low. So it's a little surprise that in the prestige hierarchies of many professions, mental health professionals, clinical psychologists as opposed to other psychologists, psychiatrists as opposed to surgeons or anesthesiologists, are lower status because of the association with mental health issues. Let's go to the next, please. It's clear, of course, we all talk about mental health more than in the silent 50, 60 years ago. Psychology courses exist in high schools. The media do discuss mental health issues more. Haven't attitudes improved? Look at gay marriage, as I mentioned 10 minutes ago. Attitudes have dramatically improved in the last 15 years. Intriguingly and utterly depressingly, clear evidence exists that since the 50s, fundamental attitudes toward mental health, especially the public's desire to be close to or distant from, it's called social distance, has hardly budged. The same measures have intriguingly been used every 5 years or every 10 years in many studies. Fundamental attitudes towards mental health issues have remained flat. And in fact, 3 times more Americans today than in the silent 1950s, if they confront the term mental illness, immediately associate the person in question with being aggressive or violent than before. Well, homelessness is now a big issue. It may be that by closing many of the state mental hospitals, more and more people with serious mental illness are out on the streets. It's hard to get people into the few hospitals left. You have to be a danger to yourself or others. That's some of California's laws, similar to other states. So it may be that society half-consciously says mental illness, well, that's associated with violence. We need to move the dial. We need to think of policy-related, media-related, and one-on-one related strategies to reduce the stigma. One strategy, looking at the bottom of the slide, has been, as the research has shown in the latter decades of the 20th century and on until the 21st, that there is substantial genetic vulnerability for many forms of mental illness. Wouldn't it be logical to just say that all mental illness is caused by aberrant DNA? It's in your genes. It's a brain disease. It's a disease like any other, the biogenetic attribution model. Because if somebody's got an illness, well, we can't hold them responsible. Alcoholism isn't a character flaw, it's an illness. Well, it's interesting. Many studies have now shown that if members of the public are led to believe that mental health issues are caused by aberrant genes, their brain diseases, diseases like any other, they do blame the person in question less, but they also are quite pessimistic that the person can ever get better. I mean, their brain is involved. It's a genetic disorder. And social distance actually increases rather than decreases. This is called the mixed blessing model of biological ascriptions to mental health issues. We don't want to promote the stereotype and myth that mental health conditions are all caused by bad parenting, but nor do we want to jump to the other extreme that it's all about biology. It's like coronary artery disease. Leading killers worldwide. There is genetic vulnerability, yet lifestyle choices, diet, exercise can also play a role in mitigating risk. The same is true for mental health issues. We can't reduce it to it's evil spirits or animal spirits, or it's bad parenting only, or weak personal will or moral fiber, or bad genes. it's an interesting combination of developmental factors, which is what I teach about at Berkeley, and developmental psychopathologists are doing worldwide now. It's a complicated set of forces, just the way it is for many chronic physical illnesses. Dehumanization at the very bottom of the slide is crucial. If we start to believe that a person of religious group X or skin color Y isn't fully human, if we tend to believe that an individual who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or PTSD or autism isn't really like the rest of us, they're a separate subspecies, we will exclude, isolate, dehumanize, and even exterminate. So that the consequences are quite dire. Let's move ahead. Maybe all of the data in the world about state policies and studies of explicit attitudes or implicit attitudes go some way in helping illuminate why stigma still persists. But we also have to look qualitatively and at narrative. Stories matter. Humanization is going to require that people with mental health issues no longer be silenced, and personal accounts and family accounts may carry the day toward enhancing humanization. Case studies aren't adequately controlled. The bottom of the slide may not generalize, but enough case studies may suggest the right variables to look at for how to improve mental health and how to reduce stigma. Let's go to the next slide. I wrote a book on this topic that came out last year. It's coming out in paperback in early 2019. Another Kind of Madness, St. Martin's Press. The subtitle, as you can see, is A Journey Through the Stigma and Hope of Mental Illness. Very briefly, on this cover photo, taken when I, on the right, was 18, with my 70s hair and mustache, and my father sitting next to me, a philosopher at Ohio State, who had trained as a grad student in Princeton with Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, both of whom he got to know well, a brilliant philosopher, very warm father, would disappear when I was a boy and my sister was a girl for 3 months or 6 months, or in one case, 12 months at a time. And nobody ever talked about it. I had no idea if Dad at those moments was alive or dead, but I didn't know until just before this picture was taken, when I'd returned from the East Coast back to the Midwest for my first spring break back in Ohio, was that he had been shipped off against his will to some of the nation's worst mental hospitals since he was a teenager, throughout his 20s and 30s, when I was a boy and my sister was a girl. But his lead doctors in Columbus, Ohio said, if your children ever learn of your serious mental illness, thought to be schizophrenia, later correctly diagnosed as bipolar disorder, if they ever learn of your serious mental illness and hospitalization, this knowledge will permanently destroy them. So, to my dad, you, and to my mom, your wife, must never talk about it. You're forbidden from ever raising the topic. So the doctor's orders were, in the 50s and 60s as I was growing up, no mention of mental health or mental health issues or mental illness could ever happen lest my sister and I be permanently destroyed. As I say in one passage of the book, what would we think today if an oncologist told a patient, never tell your children about your cancer, it will permanently destroy them? Well, we probably want to sue that doctor for malpractice. Remember, however, that back in the 1930s and 40s, even as recently as the 1950s, if your relative, if your grandmother or your uncle or whoever died of cancer, your family never put the cause of death in the obituary. Because it was clear back then that cancer, this mysterious illness, was really related to low moral fiber, weak personal character. In some ways, you'd given up and let the cancer overtake you. Cancer was highly stigmatized. Now that people talk about cancer, now that breast cancer is a cause, now that, is it this Sunday or next Sunday, a couple of Sundays this fall, the NFL behemoths will wear pink knee socks, every single one of them during NFL games, to raise public awareness of breast cancer. Society, policymakers, funders can no longer ignore it because people with cancer have spoken up and talked about their experiences and their coping and their everyday struggles and heroism. This is maybe, in my view, the key element of fighting the stigma of mental health issues. You've got to be able to talk about it. By talking about it, you've got to be able to get treatment. Treatments can help with the core symptoms. Treatments can help with the impairments, and the stigma will reduce. The paradox of paradoxes is what? We don't yet have cures for mental illnesses. A lot of research needs to be done before we're close. But the treatments we do have, sometimes medications, more often psychotherapies, group therapies, family therapies, evidence-based treatments, have bigger effects on average than the effects you get from seeing your doctor for a physical health issue you go in to get treated. We can put a dent in mental health symptoms. We can enhance functioning. We can promote recovery. But if we never talk about it, if shame and silence pervade, we're never going to make the progress we need. Let's go to the next slide. My dad very quickly was born early in the 20th century, the fourth of four boys. His mother died when he was 3 of cancer. That's a big risk factor for having a later mood disorder. My grandfather moved the boys to Pasadena, remarried. Step-grandmother and my grandfather, their family of 6 boys, lived in Pasadena. Very strict Methodist and Quaker household, prohibitionist household. My dad's first episode occurred when he was 16. Let's go to the next slide. There's before 16. Here's the 4 boys in my dad's family. Dad's in the wagon on the right. He's 3. His mother has just died 2 months ago. The other boys, the older boys, seem to have somehow resolved this. A 3-year-old, we know that if you're 3 and 4 when your parent dies, that's a big risk for later mental health issues, especially depression. Move to the next slide, please. At age 16, my father became totally preoccupied with, this is the mid-30s, with the Nazi threat in Europe, threatening to take over the world, and believed over the period of 3 or 4 sleepless days that he alone could stop this threat. And if he lifted his arms up, they would be wings and he would fly. He jumped from the roof of his family home, trying to fly to send a message to the world's leaders, was hospitalized for 6 months in a backward mental hospital, almost died of malnutrition because he believed the Nazis had poisoned the food there, miraculously recovered without treatment, which can happen sometimes with bipolar disorder after months of suffering. And his life of very high achievement, Stanford BA, Princeton PhD, studying with Russell and Einstein, and utter madness, untreated, uncontrolled bipolar disorder, that cycle had begun. He was hospitalized after he got his PhD as World War II was ending, again, believing that he could save the world from the Nazi threat, and with the delusion, while at that hospital, that he was housed in a concentration camp. Well, that was highly irrational. If you get sufficiently manic, you may have psychotic beliefs. But in some ways, the hospital at which he stayed, Byberry, was the worst mental hospital in the United States. Many deaths, many beatings, 7,000 men on the men's unit in space for 1,500. In some ways, his delusional belief was not far from the truth about what the outcome of many people in U.S. institutions were that were not too dissimilar from the outcomes of those in concentration camps. Okay, we're going to run out of time, so let's go to the next slide. Here's a picture of my dad graduating from Pasadena High as valedictorian, heading off to Stanford. He had a full scholarship to Berkeley, made a bad choice, went to Stanford instead, but I forgave him for that once I learned this later. Let's go to the next slide. Just a couple of more photos. Dad had many episodes when my sister and I were young. Again, the doctor, his lead doctor, was clear. No one was ever to learn about it. Once I went to college and came back home for my first spring break, Dad decided to break the doctor's orders. I was no longer a child. I learned the truth. I didn't think Dad had schizophrenia. I helped to diagnose him correctly with manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. I set about to pursue the field of psychology and work with kids and families. But for many years, I never told anybody what Dad was telling me about his life of these episodes because I was too ashamed. Stigma begets stigma and silence and shame. Once I began to open up, talk, write about, do advocacy for mental health, in addition to the research and clinical work I was doing, my life took a change, and a lot of my research program now is just as much about fighting mental illness stigma as it is about finding causes and cures for mental health conditions. Let's move ahead. We're going to wrap up very quickly. Here's a later picture of all 6 of the boys, the 4 original boys. Dad's in the t-shirt, 4th from the left, the 2 half-brothers. Don't have time to discuss it. Let's move ahead to the next slide. There's Dad and me after I got my PhD from UCLA in clinical psychology, celebrating. Mom and Dad were out. Mom took a picture of Dad and me. We're on a beach near Santa Barbara. Dad's in his mid-60s, very robust. He finally got on lithium. But if you go to this next slide, you'll see that just 5 years later, I had my first visiting appointment at Berkeley. We're up at Stinson Beach. Mom took our picture again. Dad has lost 25 to 30 pounds. He's starting to stoop. He had begun to develop the Parkinson-like illness that ended up taking his life a few years later. And I can't help but think that all of the wrong medicine he got for 20 years, all of the misguided electroconvulsive shock therapy treatments he got, when if he'd had the right diagnosis he might not have needed, began to take a toll on him physically. Nonetheless, we talked deeply until almost literally the day he died. Let's do our last couple of wrap-up slides. How are we going to combat stigma? Well, top down. The Americans with Disabilities Act, now in its 28th year, prohibits in the workplace or in public in our country discrimination against people with physical or mental disabilities. Most people with mental disorders, however, never make use of ADA because they're afraid to tell their employer or they're afraid to admit that they have a mental health issue. Parity. We need to have the same kinds of coverage for mental health as we do for physical health. It's on the books in theory, but there's loopholes big enough to drive a truck through. If we're going to fight stigma, we need to enforce anti-discrimination policy. What about working from the middle out, if you will? Media images need to change. Human interest stories abound, but think of the book and movie A Beautiful Mind. John Nash won the Nobel Prize in economics for game theory after a life of chronic schizophrenia. This was stigma busting. This was incredible. However, if the main stories are about the 1 in a million person with chronic schizophrenia who wins the Nobel Prize, maybe if you have schizophrenia, you're either homeless and on the streets or you win the Nobel Prize, and not much in between. What we need is stories and images of everyday struggles, everyday heroism, so that it's not infamy in terms of being at the bottom of the heap or the top of the heap. What are we going to do as a university, as teachers, as students, as administrators, as staff members, society members? Encourage people around you to open up. Encourage yourself to open up. Does everyone with a mental health condition need to wear a sandwich board every day advertising their diagnosis? No. Disclosure needs to be planned and rehearsed and done thoughtfully. If we have the default position, however, that you can never talk about it, the way my family was ordered when I was young, we're in big trouble. What did I believe as a kid? It must have been my fault that Dad had vanished from time to time. I was not a good son. If something's going wrong in a family but nobody's discussing the truth, kids can either believe the world is a cruel, random place, or, more typically, internalize, take on the blame, devastating for self-worth, predicts later depression, but at least you maintain some control. Let's go to our last slide or two. We're doing a lot of work with high school kids throughout California, hoping to expand across the country. with Glenn Close's organization, Bring Change to Mind, starting clubs, not mental health treatment groups, but clubs of everyday high schoolers who want to use their natural tendencies toward social action and compassion to fight stigma. We think that with this club model catching on, another generation from now, when these high schoolers are middle-aged adults, there may be a very different set of societal attitudes happening. Let's see, do we have another slide or two? We've shown with both experimental and quasi-experimental data that kids participating in these clubs learn a bit more about mental health issues, but mainly they reduce their social distance. They want to be closer to people with mental health issues, and that's really the holy grail. That's the name of the game. If you advance one more, we may be at the end of the deck. Let's check the time. We've got a few minutes left for questions from chat or live. Maura, do you have questions?
We do. Well, we have a comment that was entered by one of our participants, and she wanted to make, of course, a supporting point regarding reducing stigma. She mentions that studies have shown that to improve understanding and acceptance of autistic children by non-autistic children, it's far more effective to educate the non-autistic kids about autism than try to teach autistic kids to pretend not to be autistic.
Boy, is that true. So let me make a quick comment on that. We need to up mental health literacy across society. Yeah, we know more about mental illness than we did before, but too often what we know from high school psychology courses, et cetera, are symptoms. Symptoms can feed into stereotypes. We need to learn that people with autism can go on to do great things, as can people with bipolar disorder, PTSD, et cetera. We need to humanize as we educate. It's not that the kid with autism spectrum disorder has to pretend he or she does not have it. We have to get treatment for kids to thrive, and we have to allow for greater tolerance and behavioral diversity among the rest of the general public. It's really a two-way street.
Yes, and we have another question, which you may not know the answer to, but we'll see if perhaps there's an attendee that may know about these particular resources at one of our locations. Bear with me a sec. Let me go up to the top. Someone asks, do you know of groups or discussions that happen at UC Davis for parents of children with mental illness and/or ADHD?
So I know people at Davis. Our oldest went to Davis for a couple of years before transferring to Santa Barbara and then to UCSD, where he got his graduate degrees. So I am not, in my mind, a clearinghouse of information about each campus. But the Student Health Center at Davis, Counseling and Psychological Services, as it's called on other campuses, should have on their website or with a phone call lists of support groups for students, support groups for parents. As we know, shift coverage for students doesn't last for terribly many sessions, but if you make a good referral, there's community practitioners out there. I would go to the Student Health Center at any particular UC campuses and get access to lists of community resources.
Yes, and I will support that particular point in my closing remarks in terms of access to mental health services. We have another question. What are some specific ideas for what we can do on our campus, both for faculty and our students, undergraduate or graduate students, to reduce stigma?
So a couple of years back, I was on the UC Berkeley Chancellor's Advisory Committee for Student Mental Health. We on the committee talked with the Provost and Chancellor at some length about the seeming crush of mental health issues among undergrads and grad students. Every campus around the country is experiencing this. I and others on the committee tried to make the point that because of greater awareness, earlier treatment, now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, we have in some ways a fairly radically different student population than we did. It's much more inclusive of race and class. It's much more inclusive of mental health issues because in childhood or adolescence, kids with pretty serious depression or bipolar disorder, PTSD, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, are now getting into campuses, getting accommodation and support, and they, quote, wouldn't have been college material a couple of decades back. But how well do those students thrive? How good are the accommodations they get? How well trained are the professors? So at Berkeley, faculty now get the blue folder and the gold folder for Cal's colors, informing in understandable ways faculty about warning signs of depression and other mental health issues, and giving faculty a much better sense of the various resources within departments and across the campus. I know other UC campuses are doing this. I think we need to, at a more fundamental, almost philosophical level, realize that getting into college these days is more stressful than it's ever been. I don't need to repeat the headlines about increasing numbers of applicants, either flat or decreasing the numbers of admission slots, what the GPAs have to be, and all the extracurriculars, and the stress and the lack of sleep and the multiple activities. I've written another book called The Triple Bind a few years back about how these accumulating pressures are putting teenage girls at ultra high risk for depression, eating conditions, self-harm, and other internalizing disorders. I think we need to have our high standards as Berkeley and all UC educators, and we need to learn how to talk to students during office hours and really make avail of, and this is a campus-wide responsibility, the many resources that campuses have for support for faculty, support for students. If we don't do this, we're not going to promote the thriving that we need to for the entire campus community.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Hinshaw, we have a couple other questions. Someone asks, what's the best way to be helpful to colleagues who may struggle with mental health issues?
Well, let's say it's a fellow staff member. Let's say it's a fellow faculty member. You suspect something's not going so well. Marital this, life stress this, salary issues, irritability, not showing up for work. We don't want to be priors, but we want to be supporters. Person to person, it seems like you're struggling. Do you want to talk about it? Are there ways that I could help you get support? The casual conversations that lead to empathy, compassion, and understanding may be the triggers of having that person motivated to get support. Something I didn't mention during the all too quick slides is that we know some intriguing and utterly depressing data from the United States from a few years back. For adults with mental health issues in our country, what's the average length of time between the period at which, as a teenager or in your 20s or whenever, you first started to note that there were symptoms of depression or some other mental health issue, and the time you decided to get assessment and treatment? The average is a decade, 10 years. For some conditions like OCD, it's closer to 2 decades, partly because of lack of appropriate mental health insurance, but also probably even more because of shame and denial and stigma. If we can't get the social support we need from our colleagues or give it out, we may be almost colluding with the person's struggle. The person may initially say, none of your business, I'm doing fine, but it's like talking with teenagers. Our youngest is still 15. Slow, steady support, wind in that ear, the person may eventually say, you know, it's been hard for me to talk about, but here's what's going on.
Great. We have some additional questions. Bear with me. Sorry, I have to scroll down through the chat. Someone says, of course, thank you so much for this session. I hope there will be more in the future. They've been very interesting. Can NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, form campus groups to educate students and faculty?
So there's, just let's go back a few decades in history, talk about self-stigma and courtesy stigma. What did my dad never have as an undergrad or grad student or young professor, et cetera? Any kind of support group for other people struggling as he did with, in his case, with very extreme mental health symptoms. starting in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, up through the current decade, there's now a plethora of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. I'm not going to list all. Most UC campuses now have chapters of Active Minds, which started back east 17 years ago with one chapter at Georgetown, and there's now 500 chapters of Active Minds on most major college campuses in our country. Student-led groups to talk about depression, suicide, and mental health issues. I think campus by campus, I know that NAMI does work with UC Berkeley informally. I don't know the mechanisms through which support groups can come in, but Active Minds, I believe, has a chapter at every campus. Bring Change to Mind, my closest organization, for which I'm a scientific advisor, has not only been sponsoring high school clubs for kids, but leading the pack was Indiana University, which for the last 4 years has engaged a 4-year-long anti-stigma program for the 4 years ago freshmen at IU who have recently graduated to try to do campus-wide stigma change measures. So without being too specific, because I know we're out of time in another minute or two, I would encourage anybody to talk to administrators and see if self-help support groups in the community can get engaged in our campuses.
Yes, we are out of time, and I just wanted to briefly wrap up in terms of reminding everybody that the recording of this webinar will be available on UCNet's Stigma-Free UC page. In addition to this recording, there's Dr. Hinshaw's original recording and all subsequent recordings. And as Dr. Hinshaw mentioned, all faculty and staff do have individual behavioral health benefits. You would go to UCNet and search using the keywords behavioral health. In addition, another resource available is that there are employee assistance programs or faculty staff assistance programs, and most UC locations have on-site employee assistance offices with counselors that you could speak with face-to-face. A list of all EAP resources available on UCNet, and you would simply search UCNet using the keyword EAP. So upcoming, please look for an announcement about our next webinar in November on the Stigma-Free UC page on UCNet. And for there's about 2 questions we didn't get to. I will reach out to, I will pass those on to Dr. Hinshaw, and he can respond. If there's general information questions about resources, I will do my best to provide that information to everyone who attended. All right, well, we thank you so much again for joining us. And someone just asked, can you submit questions after the webinar is over? Yes, because I will leave the chat open for just a moment, probably for the next 5 minutes, and then I'll need to shut the meeting down. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Hinshaw, for your expertise and sharing this wonderful knowledge that you have on this particular subject. And thank you, everyone, again, for attending. I will leave the chat open.